Hello Magic Makers, welcome to Storytime with Mombierella. This is a young adult fiction and may be inappropriate for some younger viewers. The Odd Sisters, A Tale of the Three Witches by Serena Valentino. Copyright, Disney Enterprises Incorporated, 2019. Chapter 8, Sisters Have Secrets. It had been many years since Nanny had visited the fairylands. She never thought she would return after she helped her sister rebuild it, but now her life had traveled full circle, coming back to this place after Maleficent's death. She felt the loss of her more profoundly there in the fairylands, the place where she had raised and loved Maleficent, like her own daughter. Remembering the wonderful, smart, and gifted girl she had been, remembering how her sister had played a part in the destruction of the person she had loved most in the world. But taking a page out of Grimhilda's book, she pushed her feelings deep within her, where they were harder to access. After all, her sister had suffered for her part in Maleficent's death, and she had been admonished by Oberon. Nanny and the fairy godmother had forged a tentative bond, one Nanny was afraid of breaking. So she pushed down her feelings. She put them in a place she didn't have to deal with just then, a place where Maleficent lived within her, a secret, private place, where the little girl she loved could reside without devouring her from the inside. She almost longed for the days before she had discovered her true identity, the days when she was just Tulip's nanny, before Flans woke her from her long slumber. Things had been so much easier then. Now, as she looked around the fairylands, all those feelings she had been struggling to push deep within her bubbled up. For there was her old cottage, and there was Maleficent's treehouse, right where she had left it. The sight of it made her cry. She cried over the loss of her adopted daughter, and she cried over giving Aurora to the three good fairies. She cried for all of it, and she cried for herself. But she had to be strong. She had Tulip and Circe to look after now. Though something told her she needn't worry about Tulip any longer. She was becoming the woman Nanny had always known she would be. Circe had set Tulip on that path. She was now smart, adventurous, and independent. She couldn't be prouder of her princess. Circe was the one who needed Nanny now. Circe was in real danger, because she saw the path that lay before her, and Nanny thought she knew the road Circe would take. It struck a terrible fear within her heart. Yes, it was better that Circe was off with Snow White. Better she wasn't here while the fairies decided her mother's fate. She didn't think Circe could take hearing one more horrible story about them, or some wretched thing they had done in the name of protecting her. She knew the fairies would come to the same conclusion as Circe. The sisters should never be set free. Nanny knew Circe would never be able to thrive in the shadow of her mother's. She would never be able to reach her full potential if she had to keep cleaning up after the maelstrom her mother's destructive forces left behind. She would spend the rest of her life making amends for her mother's foul deeds, if they were unleashed on the many kingdoms. The thought was unfathomable. As Nanny opened her old cottage door, it was like being punched in the chest. The pain of being back there was so alive within her, it felt as though this was the place she kept all her secrets, all her pain, all of her suffering. It wasn't within her at all. It was here, in this cottage. She knew she couldn't stay. Not so close to Maleficent's treehouse. Not in the kitchen where she'd fretted over Maleficent's fairy exams. Not in the place she'd spent the most beautiful and painful days of her life. "Sister, I knew it was a mistake to bring you back here. I can see it in your face." Nanny had almost forgotten her sister was by her side. "You were right, my dear sister. Can I stay with you after all?" The fairy godmother nodded. "Of course you can." As she closed the door to her old cottage, and the two fairies made their way to the fairy godmother's home, Nanny decided to leave her pain behind. That was where she had been stuffing all her pain. Not deep within herself as she had imagined. There wasn't room for much else, with Maleficent residing there. So her pain lived in her old cottage, and that was where it would stay, until she was ready to revisit it. The farther down the path she got, the less severe her suffering was, until she felt it only in the distant, familiar way she'd grown to live with. This she could manage. She had lived too many lifetimes, and the memories of those lifetimes were too great to carry around with her, too heavy. She was happy she had a place to put them. "Did you say we would be meeting with the other council members today, unofficially, to decide how to proceed?" The fairy godmother gave her sister a sly look. "I hadn't said so, but I was about to." The ladies laughed. "Well, I think that is a good idea." "Who's on the council now besides you and me?" asked Nanny. "The 3 good fairies, the blue fairy, and Oberon if he chooses." Nanny reminded herself that she wanted to send a firefly to Oberon with a message about the meeting, in the event her sister had conveniently forgotten. "Do you still employ fireflies to send messages, my sister? I want to send one to Oberon." The fairy godmother wrinkled her nose. "Oberon hears all, my sister. There's no need to summon him. Besides, I'm sure he's busy with Tulip healing the wounded tree lords." Nanny shrugged her sister off. "Well, I want to send him a letter nonetheless, and I'd like to know how Tulip is doing. So if you could direct me to some paper and a quill when we get to your cottage, I would appreciate it." "Well, here we are now." The 2 fairies had arrived at the fairy godmother's cottage. "Oh, look at this!" The fairy godmother clapped her hands together in delight. "Isn't it lovely?" The good fairies had apparently been very busy awaiting their arrival. Fauna, Merryweather, and Flora had decorated the cottage in pink and blue sashes, large glittering bows, and festive banners. The house looked like one of Mrs. Tittlebottom's birthday cakes, but far more garish. Nanny had forgotten her sister lived in such an idyllic cottage, with its perfect white picket fence and trestles covered in frosting pink flowers. It was like something out of a fairy tale, and then Nanny laughed. This was a fairy tale. They were in the fairylands, after all. The 3 good fairies flitted around the fairy godmother like buzzing bees, zooming to and fro, and lavishing her with greetings, love, and admiration. And then came a litany of rapid-fire questions that made Nanny's head spin, each of the fairies talking of the other. "So what is this I hear? Have the odd sisters really brought Maleficent back to life? Do you think she'll be in her dragon form? Do you think she can bring back Ursula? Do you?" The questions went on unceasingly until Nanny loudly cleared her throat. "Fairies, fairies, please," Fairy Godmother said. "I would like to get my sister inside and settled. We can discuss all of this at the council meeting later this afternoon." The 3 good fairies blushed. They'd forgotten to greet Nanny. Yes, of course. We're so sorry, said the 3 fairies. "We will get everything ready for our meeting while you settle in." And they flitted away before Nanny could say hello or goodbye. She laughed, remembering why she hated the fairylands. How frivolous and silly fairies were, even though she was one herself. It was why she had decided not to wear her wings, and to identify as a witch. As if she could hear Nanny's thoughts, the fairy godmother said, "You realize you will have to wear your wings for the meeting, my sister." Though Nanny's sister didn't share her gift of mind reading, she often could read Nanny's expressions and guess what she might have been thinking. Nanny frowned. "What about Circe? If she takes your offer, will you fashion her a pair of wings and make her wear them? She's a true witch and has no fairy blood within her, yet you have offered her an honorary wish-granting fairy position." Nanny's sister stamped her foot in frustration. "But you are a fairy, and you should be proud." Nanny didn't want to argue with her. She had to remember her sister had taken on the responsibility of ruling the fairylands for many years, and she really was doing the best job she knew how to do, without Nanny's help or Oberon's. And now Nanny and Oberon were back, telling the fairy godmother she'd been doing everything wrong, when she'd just been doing it the way she'd learned, and the way she thought was right. Nanny saw that clearly for the first time, and decided she would help her sister make changes in stages. Otherwise, it would turn the fairylands upside down. Nanny intended to change everything. She would just have to see what the other fairies had to say. She knew the 3 good fairies would take the fairy godmother's side. But she was almost sure the blue fairy would agree with her. And Oberon, well, he always chose what was right. The more Nanny had thought about it, the more she had come to believe it was the fairy's duty to take care of all those in need, not just the princesses. And that would surely come out at the odd sisters' trial. If Grimhilda and Ursula had had fairies to intervene on their behalf, perhaps the odd sisters wouldn't have destroyed them with their foul, meddling magic. Nanny knew that wouldn't make sense to someone like the fairy godmother, someone sworn an oath to protect the innocent. whether that be a princess in need or a little boy brought to life by the wish of a doll maker. And that meant bringing more fairies into the council, and witches like Circe, to change the way fairies had been doing their magic for centuries. Their first change would be Nanny taking the fairy godmother's place as the head of the fairylands. But that, too, would have to happen slowly, for fear of hurting her sister. Nanny just had to go about all this as gently as she could. "Yes, sister, I'll wear my wings if that will make you happy. Should we make our way to meet with the other fairies? Are they waiting for us?" The fairy godmother smiled. "Yes, I'd hoped you would have more time to get settled in, but I do think we should start making our way to Oberon's fountain fairly soon." Nanny took her things to the guest room and sat on the end of the bed for a moment, gathering her thoughts and her courage to make her fairy wings visible. She was in the fairylands after all, and perhaps in making these changes she would finally feel proud to be a fairy. "Sister! Sister, come quick!" It was the fairy godmother. She was screeching from the front room, and Nanny ran in. "What is it?" she asked, looking at the assembled fairies, all crammed into her sister's cottage, and all in a state of panic. "What's happened?" The three good fairies and the fairy godmother were too upset to speak. It was the blue fairy, the ethereal creature of light, who spoke. "Fairy godmother just got a crow from Oberon. It's the odd sisters. They've somehow managed to escape the land of dreams. They've awoken and left Morningstar." "But how did this happen? Not even Circe can break the fairy magic keeping them there. How did they escape? Was it Maleficent?" "Oh dear, I hope not," the fairy godmother said. "Then who woke them? They didn't wake themselves. Who would be foolish enough to unleash the odd sisters on the many kingdoms?" asked Merryweather. "I can only think of one creature so loyal to the odd sisters that she would risk everything to set them free," Nanny said. "Flans."
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this reading. If you haven't had a chance to, please take a second, like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, comment down below, share with a friend, and check out some of the other Villain series chapters and books as well. Join us next time, and remember, let it go and keep moving forward. Have a magical day. Bye!